Hello everyone. This video resumes taking you through your close reading and annotation of the text of Blood Brothers, resuming on page 20. But before we start with this new section, I just want to add a quick final observation which relates to the section which precedes this, the section where the catalogue man and the finance man come to take back the goods which Mrs. Johnstone has brought on credit and which she can no longer afford to pay for. And it's just a reminder that in any work of literature, but particularly in a work of literature like Blood Brothers, which is so overtly political, it's the way that all minor characters have a clear structural purpose. Now, those two there, the finance man and the catalogue man, clearly represents, on the one hand, the cruel and uncaring attitude of society, and again also they further that theme we've talked about the idea of consequences. If you think about the kids, Mrs. Johnston's other children, the only time we ever come across them is when they're making these kind of various shouted demands like that, and like the one at the beginning of the play as well. And again, they serve that clear structural purpose, which is to reveal information about what life is like for her. It's worth always thinking about minor characters critically in that way. But anyway, now to continue on with Mr. and Mrs. Lyons. In the case of Mr. Lyons, he's a slightly more major, but still relatively minor character. But again, he's very representative of what Willie Russell sees as being middle-class attitudes and middle-class problems. So we will resume then now. So, Mr. and Mrs. Lyons enter their house and we see them looking at the child in its cot. Mrs. Johnstone enters and immediately goes about her work. It's important that she does that immediately because we see how conscientious she is. Mrs. Johnstone stops work for a moment and glances into the cot, beaming and cooing. Mr. Lyons is next to her with Mrs. Lyons in the background, obviously agitated at Mrs. Johnstone's fussing. Why would she be agitated? Well, because she is concerned that Mrs. Johnstone will always have a closer bond to the baby than she does. Mrs. Johnstone talks to the baby and says, "Oh, he's really coming on now, isn't he, Mr. Lyons? I bet you're dead proud of him, aren't you, eh?" Mr. Lyons good-naturedly says, Yes, I am, aren't I, Edward? I'm proud of Jennifer, too." Mr. Lyons beams at his wife, who can hardly raise a smile. Of course, the irony here is, you see, Mrs. Lyons knows the truth. Mrs. Johnstone says, "Ah, he's lovely," and she coos into the cot. "Ah, look, he wants to be picked up. I'll just—" No, Mrs. Johnstone, he's fine. He doesn't want to be picked up." Now, there's two things going on there. First of all, it reflects Mrs. Lyons' comparative lack of sympathy and kindness, particularly again in contrast to the soft-hearted Mrs. Johnstone. But also, we start to get the sense where increasingly Mrs. Lyons is now becoming contrary, the way in which she will essentially argue against anything which Mrs. Lyons proposes. She can't bear to have Mrs. Johnstone around because, apart from anything else, she is a constant reminder of her guilt. So Mrs. Johnstone continues and says, "Ah, but look, he's going to cry." Mrs. Lyons replies, "If he needs picking up, I shall pick him up." "All right." Mrs. Johnstone says, "Well, I just thought. I'm sorry, Mrs. Lyons interrupts and says, "Yes, has the bathroom been done? Time is getting on." Mrs. Johnstone says, "Oh, yeah, and she exits. Mr. Lyons says, "Darling, don't be hard on the woman. She only wanted to hold the baby. All women like to hold babies, don't they?" So I suppose in a sense we see Mr. Lyons as being fundamentally out of touch. I think here is the most important thing. For example, you have these sweeping statements like "all women like to hold babies." We get a sense of the middle class as being, again, rather like when Mrs. Lyons talks about the size of her house to Mrs. Johnstone earlier in the play. We get this sense of them being out of touch. Of course, he can't understand Mrs. Lyons' reaction. We do, because we know about what she's done. We know about her guilt. So Mrs. Lyons goes on and says, "I don't want her to hold the baby, Richard. I don't want the baby to catch anything. Babies catch things very easily, Richard." here we start to see the snobbery begin to come out in Mrs. Lyons. Partly it could well be something that she has anyway, but it's ironic that that snobbery is seen by Mrs. Lyons as being a more acceptable thing than the crime of stealing babies, which I suppose technically it is, but it's interesting that she sees snobbery as acceptable. At any rate, Mr. Lyons replies, all right, you know best. You don't see her as much as I do. She's always fussing over him, any opportunity, and she's cooing and cuddling as if she were his mother. Now there's a simile with some dramatic irony for you. She's always bothering him, Richard, always. Since the baby arrived, she ignores most of her work, and she is about to cry. Is this manipulative? Is this genuine horror caused by her own guilt? Difficult to say. Either way, it doesn't reflect very well on Mrs. Lyons. Now, the reason why I earlier asked you to note that stage direction when it says that Mrs. Johnstone enters and immediately goes about her work is because that serves to contradict Mrs. Lyons' lie about the fact that she ignores most of her work. We've already seen that's not the case. Mr. Lyons says, come on, it's all right, Jennifer, you're just a little... Is this depression thing that happens after a woman's had a... I'm not depressed, Richard. It's just that she makes me feel... Richard, I think she should go. It's quite a long way that Mrs. Lyons has travelled already from promising that Mrs. Johnstone would see the baby every day. Mr. Lyons says, and what will you do for help in the house? And she says, I'll find somebody else. I'll find somebody who doesn't spend all day fussing over the baby. Mr. Lyons glances at his watch and says, oh well, I suppose you know best. The house is your domain. Look, Jen, I've got a board meeting. I really must dash. Now, this is an interesting thing as well. I think one of the very minor points about this play is that there is something about the role of fathers. Mickey, of course, has an absent father, and it's interesting just how absent Mr. Lyons is also, in his case, due to work. And I think there is perhaps something there, just a small criticism on the part of Russell about the dangers that might cause. Certainly not one of the major things, but I think it's worth noting. Mrs. Lyons then carries on and says, Richard, can you let me have some cash? Of course. I need about £50. My God, what for? £50, of course, in the 1950s here, is a huge sum of money at a time when a starting salary might be £5 or £6 a week. Huge sum of money. Once again, we're reminded of the economic power that they have, particularly over people like Mrs. Johnstone, because of their middle-class status. So he's shocked by the sum of money and says, my God, what for? And she replies, I've got a lot of things to buy for the baby. I've got the nursery to sort out. And it shows you just how wealthy they are, that he can simply say, all right, here. Not only does he agree to such an enormous sum that might be worth 10 weeks' salary, just like that, but when he hands her the money, we learn that he's carrying that amount of money in cash. Once again, rather like the size of the house, rather like its, quote, opulence, unquote, it shows their wealth. He exits. Mrs. Lyons considers what she is about to do and then calls, Mrs. Johnstone, would you come out here for a moment, please? Mrs. Johnstone enters and says, yes. Sit down. Rich and I have been talking it over, and, well, the thing is, we both think it would be better if you left. Left where? It's your work. Your work has deteriorated. Now, as I was saying, we've already seen that that's clearly a lie, but nonetheless, that's not going to stop Mrs. Johnstone one more line. Mrs. Lyons, one more line. Mrs. Johnstone says, but I work the way I've always worked. Well, I'm sorry, we're not satisfied. What will I do? How are we going to live without my job? By the way, we're talking about manipulation. Notice when Mrs. Lyons says that's plural pronoun, we're not satisfied, she's now trying to sort of recruit the power of her absent husband to add legitimacy to what she is saying. The reality is, of course, it all comes from her. Manipulative, again. Poor Mrs. Johnstone, who thought that she could manage, we see again that she's going to be forced back into struggling. Mrs. Lyons says, well, yes, well, we've thought of that. Here's, and she pushes the money into Mrs. Johnstone's hand. It's a lot of money, but, well, and again, notice the economic power that is being deployed here. Mrs. Johnstone is thinking, desperate, and trying to get it together, says, okay, all right, Mrs. Lyons, right, if I'm going, I'm taking my son with me, and we see Mrs. Johnstone and the love that she still has. As Mrs. Johnstone moves towards the cot, Mrs. Lyons roughly drags her out of the way. Now, think about that. Think about how far Mrs. Lyons has travelled from that initially sympathetic view of her as the nice, middle-class, lonely woman that we had earlier in the play. That verb phrase, roughly drags, and both the adverb and the verb there really very much emphasises that. Oh no, you're not. Edward is my son, mine. And consider there the repeated first-person pronouns there. The fact that having done this manipulation, nothing is going to stop her in it. Mrs. Johnstone says, I'll tell someone. I'll tell the police. I'll bring the police in and see in the ellipses, the pauses in her speech, and you can see it in the previous line that she had before as well. We see the some of the sort of doubt and the hesitation that Mrs. Johnstone's disempowerment causes. Mrs. Lyons says, no, you won't. You gave your baby away. Don't you realise what a crime that is? You'll be locked up. You sold your baby. And see again the accusatory tone. You. She's trying to imply that it is Mrs. Johnstone who is the guilty party here, when of course in reality Mrs. Johnstone was exploited by Mrs. Lyons. Mrs. Johnstone, horrified, sees the bundle of notes in her hand and throws it across the room. Now it's significant because by forcing it into her hand, sort of psychologically or subconsciously, Mrs. Lyons is trying to imply that Mrs. Johnstone has already agreed. Mrs. Johnstone says, I didn't. You told me. You said I could see him every day. Well, I'll tell someone. I'm going to tell. Mrs. Johnstone starts to leave, but Mrs. Lyons stops her. Mrs. Lyons says, no, you'll tell nobody. And there is music. Because if you tell anyone, and these children will learn of the truth, then you know what will happen, don't you? You know what they say about twins secretly parted, don't you? Mrs. Johnstone, terrified, says, what? The fact that Mrs. Johnstone is terrified by the superstition here that is being literally invented by Mrs. Lyons to control her shows her weakness. And it shows once again the cynicism and the cruelty of Mrs. Lyons. Mrs. Lyons continues and says, they say that if either twin learns that he was once a pair, they shall both immediately die. That is the superstition that she invents. But of course, there's a kind of dramatic irony here, because in playing God, as Mrs. Lyons does, in trying to contravene fate by taking this child from Mrs. Johnstone, she dooms herself to suffer too. And so, in tragic terms, this becomes a kind of foreshadowing. This becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, because in fact, as we, the audience, already know or are guessing from the tableau and from the prologue that we already saw, it is these two boys that will end up dead at the end of the play. She continues then, it means, Mrs. Johnstone, that these brothers shall grow up unaware of the other's existence, that they shall be raised apart and never, ever told what was once the truth. You won't tell anyone about this, Mrs. Johnstone, because if you do, you will kill them. So she turns Mrs. Johnstone's care and love for those children against her. Again, incredibly manipulative. Mrs. Lyons picks up the money and thrusts it into Mrs. Johnstone's hands. Mrs. Lyons turns and walks away. It's significant to note then here, structurally, at this point, Mrs. Johnstone, disempowered as she is, does accept the money. However, in Act 2, when Mrs. Lyons reappears and tries to bribe Mrs. Johnstone for a second time, on that occasion she is unsuccessful, because by then Mrs. Lyons, yes, is older and wiser, but is also wealthier and more independent, and that reflects the change that goes on in Mrs. Johnstone's life as well. Continues on then. The narrator enters, and remember what we said about the fateful presence of the narrator, dressed all in black, and the way that he serves to underline these most dramatic turning point type moments. And he sings, "Shoes upon the table and the spiders being killed. Someone broke the looking glass. A full moon shining and the salt's being spilled. You're walking on the pavement cracks. Don't know what's going to come to pass." In other words, then, the first stanza of this song simply lists a whole series of superstitions related to bad luck. Now, we go on then to the chorus, which is something that will recur again and again throughout the play. You know the devil's got your number, you know he's going to find you, you know he's right behind you, he's staring through your windows, he's creeping down the hall. So again, this idea of the devil got your number, the idea that the devil will punish you for your actions, again is a further quotation, a further sort of idea that links into that sort of theme of consequences that I've already mentioned. It goes on and reminds us of the power of consequences, because it says, "Ain't no point in clutching at your rosary," rosary being the beads that Catholics use as part of their prayers. He goes on, "You're always going to know what was done. Even when you shut your eyes, you still see that you sold the sun, and you can't tell anyone." So things like, ain't no point in clutching at your rosary, it's a reminder that you can't avoid the consequences. You've done it now, that's it, it's too late. No amount of confession can absolve you of this sin, is what he's saying. And he goes on, "But you know the devil's got your number, you know he's going to find you, you know he's right behind you. He's staring through your windows, he's creeping down the hall. Yes, you know the devil's got your number, he's going to find you, you know he's standing he's right behind you, he's standing on your step, and he's knocking at your door, he's knocking at your door, he's knocking at your door." And the narrator exits. That concludes this section. So this is the moment then at the start of the play. It covers the bit during Mrs. Johnstone's pregnancy until just after the birth of the children. There's now about to be a sort of time lapse before the next section of 7 years before we meet Mickey now at that age. So once again, it's a subversion of the classical unity of time, and it's very much a kind of Brechtian feature, emphasising the theatricality of this, alienation of the audience, always forcing us to be objective and, as it says, to judge for yourselves what is going on. So on page 24, we'll pause it there and we'll resume in my next video. Thank you very much.